My name is Tina Swithin. I am the founder of One Mom's Battle and the author of a series of books titled Divorcing a Narcissist. I am also a family court advocate for the past decade and a high conflict divorce coach. I look forward to sharing my personal journey and my experience as an advocate, along with the things that I have witnessed in the family court system over the past decade. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here with you. Welcome to Survivors of Domestic Violence, the Fraudulent Promises of the Family Court System. So we all know divorce is challenging, even under the best of circumstances. If one person has a high conflict personality, such as narcissistic personality, antisocial personality disorder, also referred to as sociopaths, or borderline personality, it greatly increases the conflict and it prolongs the abuse for the victim. In many situations, the abuse actually intensifies post-separation during the divorce or the child custody process. So a little bit of background about me. In 2009, I found myself in a therapist's office trying to make sense of my very confusing, painful, and toxic relationship. At the time, I did not realize that this particular day would change the course of my life. After hearing my story, the therapist gave me 3 words: narcissistic personality disorder, but she prefaced it with, "I'm not qualified to diagnose your husband, but everything I'm hearing leads me to believe that you are a victim of domestic violence, specifically narcissistic abuse. Your husband sounds highly narcissistic, possibly even sociopathic." I now know that this therapist was a rare unicorn in the world of mental health professionals. We are not afraid to call it out if someone is an alcoholic or an addict, but for some reason, we skirt the issue of narcissism. Not only did she understand cluster B disorders, she referenced it by name. I now know that my experience is not typical, but I will be forever grateful to her. With that said, I was not ready to hear this information at the time. I actually left her office that day feeling angry. How dare she tell me that I could not fix my husband? Back then, I was a fixer. I'll spare you the details, but fast forward 6 months and my entire world fell apart. I lost my marriage, my home, my cars, my businesses, and I discovered that my entire life was a facade. I did not even know who I was married to. We had over $1.5 million in debt, and the majority of that had been accumulated behind my back. Thus, my journey through the family court system began. Due to the state of our finances and severe financial abuse, I was forced to act as my own attorney. I had 2 little girls, ages 2 and 4, and I wrote my very first court declarations from the windowsill of my local domestic violence shelter, while trying to tap into a neighbor's Wi-Fi because the shelter didn't have internet service. I started my journey with less than $200 to my name. Over the next 6 years, I navigated almost 50 court dates, a 2-day trial, minors counsel being appointed to represent my children, 2 full child custody evaluations, 3 CPS investigations that deemed him to be a moderate risk, but did absolutely nothing to protect my children. I had over a dozen interactions with law enforcement and a subsequent criminal trial that lasted 5 years. This is obviously the very nutshell version, but in 2019, 10 years after my family court story started, we beat all odds and terminated my ex-husband's parental rights. If you can believe it, we are actually considered the lucky ones. Termination of parental rights is very rare, but the fact that anyone can hear our story and label us as lucky speaks volumes to the brokenness of the system. 2 years into my family court journey, I decided to start a blog. Had I had an attorney at the time, they would have probably thrown themselves in front of me and my computer to prevent me from speaking out. I bought the domain name One Mom's Battle back then, truly believing I was the only person in the world experiencing this nightmare. Writing became my therapy. It allowed me to purge the daily chaos that I was facing. It was about 6 months into writing my blog when I was discovered, for lack of a better term, by supermodel Christy Brinkley, who was also divorcing a narcissist. She had been on the Today Show being berated by Matt Lauer, which the irony in that now, given what we know about him. But during that very powerful interview, she told people to Google the term divorcing a narcissist. That night, my little blog went from 40 views per month to over 40,000. Back then, I was the only resource out there on this topic. Christy and I met a few weeks later in Los Angeles, and somewhere around that time, she encouraged me, you need to write a book. So I went to work writing my first book, and I've never looked back. I've gone on to write 4 additional books, and I very much consider myself to be an accidental author and advocate. 2 years ago, I decided, spur of the moment, that I was going to coin November as Family Court Awareness Month. It dovetailed perfectly from October's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So I put my entire family in an RV and we did a cross-country tour with 7 media stops in major cities from Los Angeles to Raleigh, North Carolina. We brought together judges, domestic violence advocates, mental health professionals, survivors, and family court professionals with the goal of putting this issue on the map. Because, as I've come to discover, very few people even know that we have a problem. We have moved mountains when it comes to awareness, and I truly believe that is a crucial step towards change. Last year was our 2nd annual Family Court Awareness Month, and we had over 225 cities, counties, and states who have proclaimed November Family Court Awareness Month in our 2nd year. That is huge. About 6 months ago, I started collaborating with some of the top advocates in the country. For the past 2 years, we have all collectively felt the momentum building. Media outlets are finally starting to cover the stories of family court tragedies and system failures. And together, we launched the largest coalition of advocates in the entire country, possibly even the entire world. The National Safe Parents Coalition is a national coalition of more than 100,000 survivors, advocates, and concerned citizens. We are advocating for evidence-based policies which put child safety and risks at the forefront of child custody decisions. You would think that's just common sense, but sadly it's not. When I first walked through the doors of the courtroom, I assumed that child safety would be the focus and the priority. I was hit with a really harsh reality that is still difficult for me to grasp, but it continues to fuel me. So there are some assumptions about the system. One is Child Protective Services, and the other is the general public. Victims of domestic violence are walking into the family court system naively believing that in their best interest is the guiding principle for the court system. What they quickly realize is that along with their family court case number, they receive their own personal terrorist, their abuser. The abuse that once took place behind closed doors now has a new venue, the family court system itself. The salt in the wound is absorbing the reality that the problems go beyond the court system, and other entities that we assume are in place to protect and serve are also failing survivors and their children. CPS. Child Welfare Services, also known as CWS or DCSF. In my humble opinion, this is a system riddled with corruption. They receive federal funding and grants from going into homes on reports of abuse and neglect, removing children and placing them in foster care, and then adopting them out. This is not to say that all CPS workers are bad or corrupt, but I tell you, the deeper you go down the rabbit hole on this topic, the more concerning and eye-opening it becomes. Case in point is whistleblower and Georgia State Senator Nancy Schaefer's investigation and report titled "The Corrupt Business of Child Protective Services." This quote is from Senator Schaefer's report. Shortly after her report was released, she was murdered under suspicious circumstances. The CPS system is particularly troublesome for POC, and it's known to target marginalized or disenfranchised members of society. By many, it is considered a child trafficking business. But CPS funding does not carry over to families of divorce or paternity cases. They do not make their money in child custody situations. This, coupled with the system-wide bias that mothers use CPS to get a leg up in custody, as quickly as a case is opened, the clock is ticking to close it. Another disconnect is between CPS and the family court system. The most common finding of CPS is unfounded. By definition, unfounded means having no foundation or basis in fact. Within the CPS system, unfounded has an entirely different meaning. An unfounded CPS report does not mean the incident didn't happen. It typically means that the child is now safe or that the child is with the safe parent. When family court professionals read that an incident is unfounded, they assume the incident didn't happen or that there wasn't enough evidence. You can imagine how this affects decisions in family court. The premise of CPS is child safety, and they are failing miserably. On a personal note, I can share my own experience with CPS. My youngest daughter was left unattended in a car for somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes after receiving strict orders from medical doctors that she was not allowed to be alone due to a seizure disorder. My ex-husband admitted to leaving her in the car while he was watching a sporting event on TV. But because my daughters were safe and with me at the time of the report, it was marked unfounded. In a separate incident, they almost drowned in a swimming pool when they were left unattended. Both went underwater multiple times as my 6-year-old tried to save her 4-year-old little sister. CPS provided a pamphlet to my ex-husband on swimming pool safety, and the case was marked unfounded and closed. Here's another common scenario related to CPS and family court. If I were to call law enforcement or CPS on my husband while we were married and report that he was sexually abusing my child, he would likely leave in handcuffs. The exact same scenario where the parties happen to be under the umbrella of family court and is chalked up to one parent trying to get an upper hand in child custody. It is really disheartening the deeper you go down this hole. And then we have law enforcement. We have responding officers with little to no training in domestic violence. The entire nation watched the reality of this with the Gabby Petito case last year. Had responding officers been trained in the nuances of domestic violence and the subtle signs, she may very well be alive today. I have personally had over a dozen interactions with law enforcement, and my experience as someone of privilege is very painful to reflect on. The stories that I hear from those in marginalized populations is even more shameful. Everything is chalked up to a domestic issue, and survivors are told to seek assistance from the court. Most officers don't even want to take a report. They want to wash their hands of it. You have the courts that are dependent on proof. So when it is a CPS stamping cases as unfounded or the police labeling things as a domestic issue, survivors are left with little to no proof of what they're dealing with outside of the courthouse. The old saying, "It's not what you know, it's what you can prove," is a painful reality for so many of us survivors. CPS and law enforcement are two of the main resources for survivors outside of court itself. Survivors are further abused by the entities that are supposed to be in place to protect them. So what is the big disconnect? The fraudulent promises of the court system. It's a big one. We are failing victims. As a society, we know the messaging that is aimed towards victims of domestic violence. Leave the abuse. For those of us who understand the complexity of domestic violence, we know that is easier said than done. When a victim of domestic violence does make the brave decision to leave, they're blindsided by their new reality. No one is preparing them for this. We know that domestic violence is about power and control. That need for power and control doesn't mysteriously vanish or dissipate when the relationship ends. Much of the time, it actually intensifies. The disconnect is the fraudulent promises, the assumptions that the protections given to victims of domestic violence will carry over into the court system. We have survivors walking into the system with this false sense of hope and security, believing that because they made the right choice, that their children will finally be protected. that they will finally have peace. Survivors of domestic violence are dependent on the family court system for protection. Instead, they discover that the abuse post-separation is often worse than the abuse they suffered during the relationship. While there are many resources available to victims of domestic violence during the relationship, the only resource available afterwards is the family court system. And this is a system that is further abusing them. How are they further abusing them? Let me count the ways. One of the most painful realizations for a survivor walking into family court is that they are immediately lumped into the high conflict category, when the reality is it only takes one abusive, toxic person to create conflict. Much of the time, the high conflict person is a narcissist, and the family court system is their playground. There's a chilling amount of victim blaming. You married him or her. This is not our problem. Often this statement is made by the survivor's own attorney. And even if it isn't verbally said to a survivor, this is the message they hear on continuous loop. The message comes through in words, actions, and inactions of the court. This is such a powerful quote by Dr. Katz. It articulates everything that is family court. When institutions coerce you into behaving nicely towards someone who has abused you, this in itself is a form of psychological abuse by the institution. You have every right to be angry with abusers, but often institutions won't allow you that right. Dr. Emma Katz. This is what we are doing to victims of domestic violence. We give them mixed messages, filling their heads with false promises, and then we fail them. Not only are the promises empty, they are forced to play nice with their abuser. And if anxiety, trauma, or PTSD render them unable to play this sick and twisted game, they're punished or labeled as the problem. Once labeled as the problem, some actually lose their children. And the ones who are able to maintain some percentage of custody lose the ability to protect their children. They are often forced to put their heads down and take blow after blow, watching their children suffer, unable to intervene due to threats by court professionals. Most are forced to develop the mindset of a prisoner. Stay busy, do your time, wait for the day your children age out of the system, and your sentence is over. Family court is a business. It's a place where human lives are reduced to case numbers and business transactions. Children are openly spoken of in terms of percentages. They're divided up like property or retirement accounts. There are a lot of professionals who are making a lot of money. The only winners in this system are the professionals and the abusers. As a divorce coach, the worst part of my job is having to tell a victim of abuse that they have to put on a presentation for the court of being a stable, safe person to co-parent with, that their presentation to the court is equally under a microscope after all of the abuse that they have been through. It is a horrible situation for a survivor to face. Where are the cracks in the system? We have three glaring issues within the family court system itself. There's a lack of training when it comes to family court professionals. There's an inadequate and insufficient testing, and there's a lack of available research. So let's talk about the training. Many are shocked to hear that there's little to no training requirements for judicial officers and other family court professionals when it comes to domestic violence or trauma. In some states, zero training is given to judicial officers. In other states, it may be 3 hours or 5 hours, but it's usually just a suggestion and not a requirement. And in some states, a requirement is put in place within the first year of being on the bench. So we have people deciding the fate of a child with zero training in domestic violence for an entire year or longer if there are no requirements. And these training videos or in-person sessions are very much the 101 version of domestic violence. I firmly believe that my teenage daughter could deliver a more powerful presentation on the reality of domestic violence than the videos or the trainings that are typically given. Then we have inadequate testing. From everything I have learned and absorbed over the years, the psychological testing that is being used by custody evaluators are flawed at best. They were never intended to be used in child custody proceedings. In conversations with many respected experts and psychologists over the years, I have been told that they are actually instructed not to diagnose NPD or any other cluster B personality disorder. So we have people being pushed to pay upwards of $10,000, $20,000 for a psych eval, clinging to false hope that it's going to help them. And they're left holding a really expensive stack of paper that's useless in helping them to protect their kids. One of my favorite quotes is from Dr. Catherine Barrett. Due to stigmas around a diagnosis, we tend to minimize traits or symptoms if they are not attached to a formal diagnosis. This is an error and a big one when it implies excusing an abuser from responsibility. Narcissistic traits might mean less criteria is met, but it certainly doesn't mean the traits that the individual possesses are less impactful or damaging. Another powerful quote by Dr. Barrett, there is a lack of cultural sensitivity when it comes to the testing that is being used. We see an undeniable cultural bias and testing tools that over-pathologize African Americans and those from Hispanic populations. This is exactly what is happening. For one, it's nearly impossible to get a formal diagnosis, but even with one, the courts are not educated on what that diagnosis means for children or for co-parenting. It gets even more watered down if the conclusion is narcissistic traits, which is the most common thing we see in psych evals from custody evaluations. To the uneducated court professionals, this means the person has a clean bill of mental health. It exonerates them of all wrongdoing in the eyes of the court. Not to mention, walking into a child custody evaluation is like entering the wild, wild west. You can have the same person and the same case information meet with 5 different evaluators, and you will get 5 very different outcomes. There is no consistency, regulation, or oversight within the court system or the evaluations. For the rare unicorns of the child custody evaluation world, those who actually get a solid diagnosis, now what? It's definitely not the end-all be-all. I've seen individuals diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, which is a sociopath, receive 50-50 custody due to an uneducated court system. Typically, All a diagnosis of NPD does is up the ante to the next level. The healthy parent is now forced to educate the court on what this means for the children through expert testimony or available research. There is a serious shortage on both. So when it comes to the research, in 2019, there was a study out of Santa Clara University titled "Confronting the Challenges of the High Conflict Personality in Family Court." This is one of the first studies to shed light on this issue, but it barely scratches the surface. We desperately need more research to protect children from these abusive, toxic, high conflict individuals. If you are interested in downloading the Santa Clara University study, you can go to npdandlaw.com. More cracks in the system. Shocking, isn't it? The cracks get even deeper. According to Dr. Jennifer Freyd, founder and president of Center for Institutional Courage, Darvo refers to a reaction perpetrators of wrongdoing may display in response to being held accountable for their behavior. Darvo stands for deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. The perpetrator or offender may deny the behavior, attack the individual doing the confronting, and reverse the roles of victim and offender. This occurs, for instance, when an actually guilty perpetrator assumes the role of falsely accused and attacks the accuser's credibility, blaming the accuser of being the perpetrator of a false accusation. Let's admit it, narcissists present very well. It's a stage for them. It's a feed or a high. Meanwhile, you've got the survivor who is typically in a state of trauma to begin with, so this dynamic can be triggering, painful, and confusing. Most survivors present very poorly. And when you're in a system that's uneducated on domestic violence, it can make them appear to be the problem. So one of the most predictable Darvo tactics is claims that the survivor is alienating the children. We refer to this as alienation distraction tactics. I could do an entire presentation on alienation. It is junk science concocted by a now deceased pedophile sympathizer, Richard Gardner, who went on to commit suicide. He was known to assist pedophiles in taking their children from healthy parents. This is the root of the present day alienation movement. It is a very disturbing phenomenon that has had a horrible but huge impact on the family court system. This legal strategy is used by the abuser to deflect from any form of accountability for their own actions, behaviors, and abuse. This topic by itself is truly an hour-long presentation, but to summarize the typical alienation allegations. For obvious reasons, the child favors the safe parent and rejects the abusive parent, leading to allegations of alienation. Classic Darvo technique. B, parental alienation claims are lodged against the safe parent as a legal strategy to cast doubt on that parent's credibility. And then C, as a defense tactic, valid claims of abuse are commonly countered with claims of alienation by the abusive parent. Another area in this whole problematic court system that weighs very heavy on my heart is the disenfranchised or marginalized individuals and communities. I consider myself to be a pretty strong, resilient person, and I acknowledge my privilege. I live in a community where I had access to legal clinics. I also connected with attorneys who would lend me their ears and sometimes their advice in the hallways of the courthouse, but this is absolutely privilege. Not all communities have these offerings. I have many people in my support groups who face ongoing prejudice, discrimination, bias, and the reality is they will likely not have the same outcome that my children and I have received. A few years ago, I was invited to Florida by the Seminole tribe, and it was an eye-opening experience to learn about the added challenges faced by the indigenous people, cultural obstacles related to domestic violence within their own communities, and also the legal system. We also have members of the LGBT communities who face discrimination and bias within the court system. I have seen protective parents lose custody for simply supporting their trans children. This battle is soul-crushing for those with privilege and resources, and even more so for those who are marginalized or disenfranchised. And number 3, we have the reality of legal professionals, judges, magistrates, commissioners, any of these individuals in positions of power. I see everything from collusion and corruption to those suffering from compassion fatigue. Thankfully, we are starting to see the media covering the issues of family court related to collusion and corruption. This is long overdue, and it's a huge issue. At a minimum, it's causing people to sit up a little bit straighter, but we have such a long ways to go on this topic. If you are in the media and you are covering these issues, keep doing it because we need you. This is a dirty industry, and there are many in positions of power who have very high NPD traits themselves. So you have a lot of egos in play and a lot of money in play. And then compassion fatigue. I absolutely see how it happens. Many judges have caseloads that are way too large, and they witness the worst side of humanity day in and day out. Couple that with lack of training in domestic violence, these issues wear on judicial officers. Even those who begin their careers with the best of intentions seemed calloused to the issues in front of them. I do absolutely have compassion for judicial officers who fall into this category. I understand how it happens. Working in this industry, I have to make a conscious decision every single day to show up and to be sensitive to what survivors are facing, never comparing abuse. Abuse is abuse, and when it's happening to your child, there is no scale that it should be put on in terms of this is more severe than this. I check myself daily for compassion fatigue. And I also have lived personal experience to guide me, so that brings even more compassion into the equation. These courts are pushing so many cases through. They are deciding the fate of children in less than 5 minutes at times. What is post-separation abuse? Post-separation abuse continues to escalate and often surpasses the domestic violence that victims are subjected to while under the roof of their abuser. After the relationship ends, the perpetrator sets their sights on the children to exert control and to terrorize the healthy parent. The children are pawns and they are weapons. Every high conflict custody battle has three basic narratives: the abuser's need for control, the abuser's need to win, and the abuser's desire to hurt or punish the healthy parent. The post-separation abuse wheel is the playbook of the abuser. Post-separation abuse does not just affect the children, the victim. It has both immediate and long-lasting effects on the kids. While there are many resources available to victims of domestic violence during the relationship, the only resource available to victims of post-separation abuse is the family court system itself. With post-separation abuse, we see counter-parenting. The family court system expects the survivor to co-parent, yet the abuser is counter-parenting. We see alienation allegations, the common tactic that we've discussed here today. Yet, alienation is also known as parental alienation syndrome, which has been discredited by every credible organization, but for some reason, it continues to be embraced by many in the court system. Then we have neglectful or abusive parenting, exposing the children to unsafe content, situations, or people designed to create fear and concern in the safe parent. This type of person will use violence, intimidation, threats, or manipulation to gain compliance from the children. Then we see isolation. This person will spread lies and rumors to friends, families, teachers, and community members to discredit the safe parent and destroy their court system, their support system, and reputation. Then we have harassment and stalking. This person bombards the healthy parent with an overwhelming number of emails, phone calls, manipulative threats, abusive messages, monitors their whereabouts, their social interactions, their social media, but many times they will go just up to the legal line without crossing it. And then finally, we have legal abuse, financial abuse, coercive control. Legal abuse, they will misuse court proceedings to control, harass, intimidate, coerce, and exhaust the financial and emotional resources of the safe parent. With financial abuse, they will withhold, mismanage, or delay support payments and court-ordered reimbursements while blocking access to bank accounts and other financial resources. And then coercive control, which the majority of the things on this wheel do fall into that category. But the definition, creating a sense of fear that pervades all elements of the safe parent's life. I want to talk about the children, the numbers. We know that research shows the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence and their children is during the initial separation. From my vantage point over the past decade, I have personally witnessed these tragedies. Many of them take place around court dates. It could be an anticipation of a negative outcome. It could be the abuser perceiving something as a loss in family court, or it could simply be the abuser losing control. While I do agree the most dangerous time is immediately following the separation, whenever a survivor is on the roller coaster of the family court system, every single day is absolutely dangerous. These 10 photos are real-life examples of family court failures. These children were denied protection despite their mother's pleas for protection. According to the Center for Judicial Excellence, which has been tracking these cases for a decade, 822 children have been murdered by a separating or divorcing parent or caregiver since 2008. 111 of these, and we believe this is underestimated, are known system failures, meaning the court had all of the information and they failed to act. I know many of the moms in these pictures, and several of them are my personal friends, and they are also fierce advocates for change. I am heartbroken for them every day. I'm honored to stand with them in advocacy. But sadly, to the majority of the world in these communities, these children's lives have been reduced to press conferences, and then they become statistics in these numbers that I'm sharing. But for these moms, for the families who loved these children and continue to love these children, and for so many others, this is personal. And it's the fuel that propels us all forward every single day. If you're interested in connecting with One Mom's Battle, we have over 60 regional chapters, one for each state in the US, and many chapters around the world, and over 100,000 members strong. When we first walk into the court system, we are all so naive. I know what a wake-up call it was for me to be lumped into that high conflict category. We have an absolute crisis on our hands that belongs to all of us. There are so many false assumptions about the system. And over the past 2 years with Family Court Awareness Month, I've reached out to mayors and other elected officials across the country. And, the overwhelming, they're looking at me sideways, going, what do you mean we aren't protecting children in the family court system? What is the purpose of the family court system if we're not protecting children? And I'll tell you, I ask myself that same question every day. And I encourage you to ask your attorney, to ask your local domestic violence shelter. Feel free to share this video and ask, what is the purpose of the court system if we are failing the most vulnerable members of our society? And we absolutely are. Thank you for your time.